welcome everybody to our webinar on chatbots and conversational AI. Now for the introduction, I hand over to our hosts.
Hi everyone, my name is Tessa Schwarz. I'm a project management team lead here at Testbirds, as well as a project manager for QA and UX. Shortly about me, I've kind of always been fascinated by human-machine interaction and the growing technologization of our society. And here at Testbirds, I was able to channel this interest into the creation of AI testing services, as well as becoming one of Testbirds' leading experts in everything to do with AI language training and testing.
Hi, I'm Sascha Wolter. I'm a technology evangelist at Cognigy, and I'm passionate about the idea of user experience and conversational AI. Well, this is somehow, well, like being a Swiss Army knife for almost everything. So I have a blade for, as said, design, conversation design. I have a blade for technology, and yes, indeed, I have a blade for business aspects either. And to add something personal, I'm a father of two, love mountain biking and things like that. So if you like to chat on this, feel free to get in touch.
Hi everybody, my name is Judith and I'm currently working as a UX researcher at Testbirds and help clients to improve their product's user experience with the help of user feedback. My interest for conversational AI started when I wrote my master's dissertation around 2 years ago, when I did some research about guiding strategies for first-time users of Amazon's voice assistant, Alexa.
Okay, so I think I have the pleasure to start. And by the way, thanks to Testbirds for having me. And I love to somehow demystify the idea of conversational AI. And as you can see in the background, there's my daughter when she was younger. And this is somehow an idea of what I'm doing at home, because I strongly believe in the idea of having an innate way to interact with devices and services. And therefore, I love to try out all those gadgets. So my home is equipped with Alexas and Google Homes almost everywhere. And I somehow observe my family using those devices to see what works, what doesn't, and to get an idea of the opportunities and indeed of the challenges either. Well, unfortunately, my family hates me for that because they feel a little bit observed by me, but you get a lot of insights if you see people using those devices. You get a lot of very valuable learnings, and I strongly invite you to do that, not with my family, just do it with your own family and friends to see what works, what doesn't, to learn from the practice. And this brings me to the most important aspect, our mission and indeed our vision. It's not about replacing humans or substituting humans. It's more about creating conversational AI, so chatbots, voice services, virtual assistants, agents, whatever, which work alongside humans, human workers, in a cooperative manner. This is the most important aspect. It's about a joint work of human and machine to fulfill some needs, some demands, to answer certain intents by the user. And the value of conversational AI is that it is possible 24 hours, 7 days per week. So you can somehow reduce the workload of your human workers using a chatbot, which is available every time without staying in the loop, waiting until somebody can respond. Indeed, you might think, first of all, that bots might answer frequently asked questions. Yes, this is something which chatbots and conversational AI can fulfill quite easily. But nowadays, it's not only about frequently asked questions and answers. It's also about processes, that we try to automate processes, complex things like let's say you need to book a room for a meeting, you have to report an incident, you have maybe you have an illness, you are sick, and you want to get that to your HR department and your line manager. And this is indeed, if you work for a huge enterprise, you know this might be complicated because a lot of people are involved. And if there is a chatbot or a conversational AI which takes over this work, this most likely will make you faster, healthy again, because you don't have to deal with that and all those details. And this is something which conversational AI can fulfill. And interestingly, conversational AI is not more than just another way of UI. It's just a user interface. And this could be used on almost every channel. It could be used via phone, via chatbot, via speaking speakers, as said, like Alexa, those Echo devices. And it also can be a text-based interface for an IoT solution, like shown in this video, or it can be used to control your dashboard with your statistic data. So you can use chatbots everywhere where conversation might help to make the experience more natural, faster, and more efficient. And this is the real value of this idea of conversational AI. Indeed, as said before, it can be used to reduce the load of your human workers. In this case, it's a robot which acts, in quotes, like a concierge. And this concierge simply can now deal, this virtual concierge can now deal with routine tasks like giving away key cards, answering questions on timetables, when does the next bus depart, things like where do I get the best coffee around. And the human worker now can do what humans can do best. He can now do what he learned for years. He can do more sophisticated things. He can take care of the individual guest's needs. He can upsell better rooms, and so on and so forth, all done in an empathic and human way. And the bot, as said, can do what computers can do best. As said, for instance, looking up addresses, looking up timetables, and this immediately without that the user has to wait. And this is quite important to know. It's about this joint work. And if you see that, you might think conversational AI is something new, but honestly, it's here since decades. The first known chatbot is called Eliza. That's a psychotherapist. And this psychotherapist did already follow some of the design principles we try to implement nowadays, because it simply tried to keep the conversation ongoing in a very naive way, a little bit like psychotherapists work in reality. It simply took the question of the user and did analyze this sentence based on key phrases, and based on those key phrases, it did ask something back. I can demonstrate it because I have a small implementation of Eliza here, done with Cognigy based on a JavaScript library. And as you can see here, it simply asks me if there's something troubling me. And indeed, always my children can at least trouble me. My kids are mean, not always, but sometimes, you know, they are now 12 and 14. That's a dangerous and difficult phase in your life. And now this bot simply asks back, does it suggest anything else which belongs to you, and so on and so forth. And if I tell them something, indeed, they treat me bad, it takes this question, and then you see it asks back something like that your kids are mean, because it has a small context. It memorizes older sentences, utterances from my side, and uses those utterances to ask back something else, to make it a little bit more flexible, to introduce more variety and to make it more natural. And as said, everything is simply based on pattern detection and some pre-built questions. So that's it. You can write whatever you want, but it always feels a little bit like talking to a psychotherapist. And this is the overall idea, but nowadays it's way more sophisticated, because that was just the beginning. And here in this slide, you can see some milestones. For instance, around that time, there have been systems understanding if you did talk to the system, not just write. They could understand digits. They could understand, like IBM Shoebox, up to 16 words plus digits. In 1976, we had something like the Harpy, could already understand thousands of words, and so on and so forth. And in the 80s, 90s, we got more sophisticated chatbots. For instance, Alice, based on the artificial intelligence markup language, more or less a more sophisticated version of ELIZA. In 97, we got a continuous transcription, so not single words. It could be used as dictating system to a complete paragraph sentence to dictate books, but all based on pattern detection. With IBM Watson, we have one more milestone because thanks to IBM, artificial intelligence got popular, and some of the outcomes of artificial intelligence you might know, Apple Siri, Google Voice Search, based on machine learning. This is the AI part inside conversational AI. This is the part where we use artificial intelligence to get the user's intent. And then you can see in the slide, 2014, Alexa did start, and the company I'm working for, which is an omni-channel company leveraging these capabilities on almost all channels, did start in 2016. This might, in terms of machine learning, artificial intelligence, sound like magic, but honestly, it isn't. Because if you think of Arthur C. Clarke, the author of 2001: A Space Odyssey, he said any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and I doubt that. I think if you get the idea, if you understand how conversational AI might work, then it's really easy. It's really easy to get it and to build your own chatbots. But to start with that, the most important part is indeed is to deal with ideation, conversation design. This is something we cover in workshops where we have some methods to find the right ideas, the scenarios, so-called micro moments where you can use conversation to fulfill something easily, where conversation makes sense, where it makes it easier, more efficient, and more natural. And there are a bunch of methods, and this is simply the starting point. But based on these methods, we also learned that it's important to deal with conversation design, because we need somebody who can deal with the idea of conversation design. That means somebody who has skills in, yes, indeed, technology, but also in psychology, linguistics, and screenwriting, because it's about conversation, and therefore you need a feeling how a conversation proceeds, how people talk to each other. This is an important part. And this person, this conversation designer, he is responsible for getting the user's intent. That's a natural language processing or natural language understanding part. So how can the user say what he wants to achieve? How can he say his requests? Can he build in terms of technical wise building, saying his intents? But the conversation designer also has to deal with the conversational logic. This is something you see here in the middle of the screen. And I think it's very important to have a tool which supports conversation design in a manner which is similar to a content management system, so that both that conversation designers and subject matter experts can build the conversation logic. And then indeed, also quite important part is how you respond, how you prompt back the answers to the user, because this makes sure that the user knows what to do, how to continue the conversation. So we have three parts where conversation design matters, and conversation design is really crucial, combined, yes, indeed, with testing and so on and so forth. But I'm really looking forward to the conversation design and testing aspects Testbirds will talk about in just a couple of minutes. Anyways, as said, the natural language understanding is one crucial part, and there we have For instance, we have machine learning. This is what we think of talking about artificial intelligence. By the way, I prefer, instead of saying conversational AI as this means conversational augmented intelligence, I prefer to say it means conversational augmented intelligence, because we try to augment the capabilities of the humans involved. But anyways, back to artificial intelligence. Machine learning is one aspect where you write down, where you collect a bunch of utterances, sample sentences to train a machine-based model. And this means training means, in this case, the user does not have to say the exact same sentence. There's a model below which has some semantic dependencies, which has some trained common sense knowledge in quotes, and therefore the user only has to say something similar. This will then be detected. And this is based on machine learning. On the other hand, you can also use keywords, key phrases, rules. And in this case, it's not that important what the user exactly writes. It's more important that the user uses the right keywords, key phrases. Just imagine you meet somebody in a pub and there's quite a lot of noise around you, and the person says something like, I like to invite and beer, but you don't get the rest in between. But you most likely will answer this question, if you like beer. Oh yes, indeed, because you have a clue. You guess he wants to invite you. You guess the user's intent simply based on a very, very basic rule. And this is the other way of getting the user's intents. And the best systems, the best platforms, they can combine both approaches. They use rules and machine learning combined, and then you usually get the best and the most natural results. But anyway, if you start with a bot is never, how to say it, it's never perfect in quotes, because it's a little bit like having a blank sheet of paper. You have to set the right expectation so that the user knows what to do. It's a little bit like meeting a dog, and you have an expectation on the capabilities, the skills of the dog. You expect the dog to fulfill tricks like give paw, get the ball, and things like that. And if you meet somehow a bird, then you probably will not say the same utterances. You won't say the same commands to this bird, like give paw and get the ball. But talking about bots, there's a blank sheet of paper. You have to set this expectation. You have to tell the user, here, I'm a bot for this certain scenario, for this certain use case. You have to say that to the user, so the user knows what to do. The user has the right expectation. That's quite important. And during usage of the bot, you will learn how people really interact with your bot. This is quite important, because in reality, users say something completely different. Users, they like to explore the bot. They try out the personality. And even if it's a bot on healthcare or whatever, the user might say something like, I love you, and how's the weather? And a good bot has a personality which can deal with that. And we think it's important to have the right tools in place for that. As mentioned before, something which supports an editorial process, like this tree-based, this graph-based approach in the top, in the bottom right. We have strong analytics tools in the top right, which you can connect to your own analytic tool via OData. We have a self-learning aspect, so the bot can ask back if he does not get it, and can improve this way the machine learning model. But please be careful with something like that. And indeed, we have something we call intent trainer, where you can see what the bot did understand and what the bot did not understand, to improve that in an also editorial way. And as said, these are some components of a platform, plus that the platform also takes care of the operational aspects. You can choose to use it as a software as a service solution, or as an on-premise solution. As said, we can connect to a bunch of channels. We have a natural language understanding built in, but you can use Lewis, you can use Dialogflow, whatever you like to use as natural language understanding. You can keep track of the context. You can maintain user profiles. So if you know the favorite color of the user, you don't have to ask back that. All aligned with GDPR. indeed, you can connect to third-party frameworks, third-party services, and you can build your own extensions. So if there's something missing in our platform, you can build it on top of our platform and add it for your usage, for your scenario, and always in a manner that you have a strong separation of concerns. So there are places where developers can do something and places where designers can do something. And finally, don't forget that if the bot gets stuck somewhere in some certain scenario, which might happen because we are still at the beginning of this idea, then it's good to have an agent handover so that the bot can change the conversation in a way that a human agent can answer that. And even that is something which is built into Cognigy. But I want to show that in practice. I give you a crash course on conversational AI. It takes just 10 minutes and then you know how to build it. And I promise I teach that my son when he was around 12. And it really did take maybe 10, 15 minutes. And he was then capable of building his own bots and did really love it and did use these bots to annoy his friends. And I like to show it to you. If you build a bot, then you usually start with something we call a flow. And our flow is something I call here Testbirds ENUS. You can choose whatever name you like here. And in this flow, where it is, here it is. In this flow, you see a green node, which somehow you can picture this green node a little bit like the brain, where every input, every utterance, every written sentence gets in, and this brain then processes the input. And we add then here a new node for the prompt for responding to the user. So simply say hello here. And you can see all the available channels on the top. If there's something you like to change across the channels in terms of multimodal aspects, adding some graphics, in terms of the text, maybe it's spoken text, display text, you can refine the answer in those tabs. But now let's start with simple bot. And if I start it here with my interaction panel, I can say whatever I like, and this bot does respond in a very easy manner. It always says hello. Okay, that's really a very dumb bot. Now I like to add some of those mentioned intents. And as said, I can choose between rule-based intents and machine learning intents. Therefore, I did click on this little tiny thing which looks like a target circle. And then I here add a machine learning intent. And let's say this is my who are you intent. So the user can ask something like, who are you? And what's your name? And name, and so on and so forth. And then I can save that. Oh, by the way, I did a small mistake. If you don't understand German, this is the German environment, the German setting of this environment. Indeed, I can change that always to English. So I can change it. I can log out here and change it to Japanese, Spain, or English. So I change it here to the English interface. Maybe you feel a little bit more comfortable, go back into my project. And here's my Testbirds flow again. And as said before, here's my intent. I trained this intent. This is important to create the machine learning model in behind with everything we have pre-trained in our machine learning model based on the English language. And if I go back now to my flow, I can use those intents with a logic node, which is called switch here. And inside my switch, I select intent. So I say to the Cognigy AI environment, I want to process the incoming intents. And now I can say that I want to deal with this certain intent, with this who are you intent, in a special manner. So that means here I add a basic say node, and I now can reply something like, I'm the friendly chat bot. And luckily my kids are born before I did start with conversational AI, because otherwise I have named my son probably Chat. And if I now try it here, I can say something without any sense. I get into the branch with hello. And if I ask, what's your name? I get, hopefully, I'm the friendly chatbot. You see, it works out through this branch. And this is according to the Pareto principle, everything you need to know for, let's say, 80% of what bots do, including small talk and everything you like to add to your bots. If I go back here into my project, you see here a bunch of conversational AI bots. And this is important to know. We have a very modular approach. You can separate aspects of your bot across a lot of flows and then combine those flows into one single flow. You can add this way small talk aspects to all of your company's bots easily. This one here, by the way, is my coffee expert because I'm a little bit addicted to coffee. And this has already a bunch of different intents built in. Some are rules-based, some are intent-based. And here I can start it. I can say something like, hi, and then I go to the start over intent and I get a question back. So something like, do I like to get a coffee recommendation? Yes, indeed. And then it continues the flow here. If you like to have something like that, a little bit more guided conversation, then we have something we call processes. This is here. You can see that where I have selected here. And if I go back to my project, I can show you a process. And this process here simply asks me for my favorite coffee, what coffee type I am. And this is a vertical design because here we walk from step to step. So each step is one turn between user, one conversational turn between user and the bot. But it's important to know, even if this is a more guided way of creating a bot, and in a lot of cases this is very efficient, it still supports the very open conversation I've demonstrated before, where you always can say whatever you want. The bot can still deal with that because we think you need both. Sometimes it's very natural. The user wants to say at least something, and he might switch his mind and add some more details to the conversation every time. But sometimes, in case the user wants to report an incident, wants simply to get a fast answer, maybe who's the best employee in my company who might support me in this case, then it might be better to have a guided conversation. And in best case, like demonstrated here, you combine this. You have all here in one flow. And yes, indeed, as mentioned before, you always can combine that with third-party integration. That means you can connect to HTTP service, to Salesforce, to Mongo databases, and we have something called custom integration framework, where you can also add some nodes which are already pre-built for a bunch of technologies. And if there's something missing, simply extend it on your own. And then once you have finished your bot, you need to publish it. That's the last step. Publishing means you need an endpoint, and this endpoint could be Alexa, a Google Assistant, so via Dialogflow, actions on Google, Twilio if you want to connect it to a landline or mobile phone number, SMS, a web chat, whatever you can imagine is available. And then you can, for instance, if you try out a web chat, you already can try it out from inside Cognigy. And as a web chat, it looks like this one. Oh yes, please, with some multimodal aspects. I want to get a coffee recommendation. And I've trained some synonyms. I can ask how to make a latte. And as said, this also works via Alexa in a very similar manner. So I could also say what I want to achieve. I can say my intents in the same manner. But getting back to conversation design and testing, yes, this is quite important. You need a proper design, and it's very, very crucial to test your bot. And we have an easy way of testing here, just the starting point for tests. We have something we call playbooks. So you can record a sample conversation, and then you can try out this sample conversation inside your bot. You can try out, does this sample conversation succeed? You can then see all the assertions, and in this case, it did succeed. So my bot still does what I expect it to do. And this leads me to the next step, to the next aspect of our webinar. it leads me to the idea of conversation design and testing. I'm totally keen to hear what Testbirds tells us about that. And therefore, I hand over to Tessa.
Okay, thank you. It's not Tessa, it's me, Judith.
Oh, sorry
but no worries. We have Tessa at the end. So thanks, Sasha, for giving an intro about how to build your own chatbot. And I basically will talk a bit about what you have to consider if you have a basic idea what you want to build, or you already have built like a little chatbot. It is important to start in the beginning to think about what to consider to have a good conversational UX. I have an abstract of 8 tips and best practices regarding what you should consider when building a bot in order to have a great user experience. And those 8 tips are a collection from general available best practices online and also my personal experience when testing chatbots for clients. So the first tip or best practice would be set the right expectations. It's a bit in a direction that Sasha already mentioned a bit. So it's very crucial for your bot in the beginning to set the right expectations and welcome the user with a short and sweet welcome message. As an example, you see like on the right side, like a little dialogue. So it doesn't have to be a huge text block. It can be like a short to not make it boring for the user. And this is basically, you have to imagine this is basically the landing page of your bot. It's the first contact the user will have with your chatbot. So that's so important because the user's first interaction with your bot, which make your bot successful or which let your bot fail. And this will also decide if your user come back or if he doesn't want to talk to the bot anymore. So think about what is the first impression your user should get when starting the interaction with your bot. So when you write this first welcome message, think about the following parts. Set the right tone. So is your chatbot more like a formal bot or an informal bot? So in the example you see on the slide, it's like more an informal bot because it starts with sweet, let's do this. It includes also some icons. The next thing you should consider is also that you should tell users what they can do or can't do. So for example, does the bot need to have specific keywords? In the example on the right side, you see that the bot already mentioned keywords like education, career, or photo. So the user could directly type in keywords like this to start a conversation. Also think about whether it is more an open dialogue you provide to the user or more closed dialogue. This is also something Sasha has shown to you some minutes before. So that means, can your user write anything, or is it more like a guided process with predefined sets of intents? So this is also something you should consider depending on what you want and also how complex your bot will be. The next important thing to consider would be the context. So we have 2 sides or two types of context. So first, it's very important to think about where your chatbot will be integrated. So as Sasha said already, so there are more channels available. So it could be integrated on a website. It could be integrated on a social media network. It could be integrated within the quiz. So think about where it will be integrated, because it's not like you're just building your bot and then it's finished. It's somewhere integrated. It's not a standalone project. And this also means that you have to think about in which situation the user will use it. So what are the circumstances the user will use your bot? Did the user already have a conversation with the bot before, or is he a new user? Will he be like in a customer service area where maybe more problems will occur? think about in which situation and also which circumstances your user might start the conversation. So regarding this, I found a very nice example of the UX chat, UX pair. I've surfed on their website several times, and as you can see in the example, he recognized it and he writes, "Ciao, it's good to have you back." So this was really a really nice surprise, because the bot recognized, okay, I have been on the website several times maybe, and he's greeting me, and we don't start our conversation from scratch. So he knows that I have been asking maybe several questions, and he explained already what he does. So we start on a totally different level as we would start from scratch. Yes. A next tip from my side would be that you also should consider to think about use cases. It sounds a bit obvious that you should not provide like a bot with useless functions, but nevertheless, I've already seen a lot of bots which have not the most meaningful use cases. That's why we should ask ourselves, does the flow for the chatbot we've created make sense? So, for example, don't try to redesign an existing process into a bot. So if you think, okay, this feature would be interesting to have as a chatbot, think first, does it really make sense? So what can the bot really do and what he can't do? So some use cases might be suitable and some might be too complex to have them in a bot. Also ask yourself the question, is it more efficient than using other channels? So is it more efficient to use the bot, or is it maybe more efficient to use a classical channel like interact with the website or doing the action in another channel? Another very important point is the personality. I think Sasha also talked a bit about it. He said that users normally will connect to your chatbot like to a person, or like to at least to a kind of virtual character. So you should also think in advance before publishing your bot, what personality type will your chatbot be? So will it be more like a formal bot, or will it be more like an informal bot? Will it be a more friendly or more conservative bot? So my recommendation is to create a persona and find out which persona fits best to the company or product the bot should reflect. Also think about things like small talk. So how would the bot do small talk? How intelligent is the bot? Will it say, for example, upfront that it's a bot, or will it, because it's very dumb and user will recognize it anyways? Or will it be more like a more complex bot with higher capabilities? Also think about if it will communicate more in an open way, so the user could write anything, or more in a closed dialogue with predefined answers. If you decide to have like a more open dialogue bot, it's even more important to create a personality for the bot. As we talk about personality, which is very close to that, is the language we need to design. So as we have only one interface or one main interaction point, the language within a chatbot, because we don't have a real user interface, we have just the language where the user can interact with. It's very important to take enough time to design the language. So if you do not have the needed skills in your team, find a language specialist if possible, and try to find the right tone of language. So as I already said, so will it be a more formal language? Will it be more an informal language? You can also see two examples. So one on the top is more like a neutral, formal way of chatting with the bot. And below, it's another example of the UX pair. It's very informal. It's very funny, and that's things you should consider. Think also about the language of your target users. So what words would your target users use in this context, and what would they expect from the bot? So would they use more technical terms? Would they use more like normal language? For this point, it's very crucial to collect a lot of data from your target group, especially as you can't really come up with all the potential phrases on your own. And if you're not sure with all the language phrases, I suggest to prototype and test it. So the easiest way is just do a role play and read the sentences out loud, and then you will recognize and already feel if specific language phrases will feel awkward or not. In the next step, of course, you should test it with your target group. As we were already talking about language, and efficient communication is also very important. So that means your bot should communicate very efficiently in the best case. On the right side, you can see an example of an inefficient communication. So the bot asks, do you want to order pizza or pasta? And the user probably might just answer yes, because yes, he wants to order something. But this could potentially lead to an error message, or the chatbot just repeats the question again, or the chatbot writes something like, I did not understand. So rather a frustrating experience for the user. So a better way to communicate what the bot can ask in order to have a more efficient communication would be, do you want to order pizza or pasta? Do you want to order pizza or pasta? No, I've made a mistake. This was the same. So you can order pizza or pasta would be the better way of communicating. And which one do you want to order? And if the bot asks it this way, the user just can say, okay, pizza, or he can say pasta, and then the flow is successful. So the tip within the communication, try to avoid ambiguities within questions. But in case like a mistake happens, which can happen all the time, because yeah, the bot will never be perfect and users will always do something what we do not expect, you should talk about failure. So try to never leave a user's comment or like a message, input, whatever, unanswered. So if the user writes something and the bot doesn't understand, try to answer to the question, even if the bot does not really understand what the topic is. So what we recommend in this case would be first, be honest. So talk about the failure on the bot side and tell the users that you're really sorry for the failure, and provide them with an opportunity to overcome the failure. This is really important because, as you see on the left side, this is a very worse or bad example, because the bot just repeats the question again, and the user has no chance to overcome the error. So on the better case, on the right side, it would be that the bot just explains that he doesn't understand, and he gives opportunities to continue the chat. So for example, he could say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand you. I can only help you with the following. Please tap 1 or choose other. So the user has an opportunity to continue the chat by pressing like the 2 options. So this is very important also to keep the flow going. With this, I come to my last point, and just for cases where like the bot really has an issue to continue the conversation, or in cases where like it doesn't really make sense to let the bot continue. So these are situations where certain things happen. So for example, it could be the case that a critical problem occurs, or like a more complex problem. The user really says he wants a human, or where we have situations where we need empathy or creativity. In these cases, you should decide to be prepared for a smooth handover between a bot and a human. So for this, you should always be in mind what task can the bot really do and what the bot can't do. So for example, simple repetitive work is something a bot really can do very good. And in really complex situations, or where the human really asks like I need help, like an example on a screenshot, the person really said, I want a human, and the bot ignores it. On the second view, it's like a better example where the bot identified, okay, we have an issue here, and suggested, okay, you can either continue with me chatting, or I give you a discount for this problem, or you can go and contact a human. So this would be like the recommendation for a smooth handover. Yes, and as you've seen, like this were only like an abstract of tips, but we're already 8, and there are a lot of things to consider in order to have a really good user experience for the bot, which also means if you really want to consider all these things, you have to ask your users. You really have to test in iterations and see what's the current status, where are the pain points between my bot and the user, and what can I do. And this is something where Tessa will talk about and give you some more best practices how we can test chatbots and how to improve with this testing the user experience.
Yeah. So as Sasha and Judith just demonstrated, a sound framework and good conversational UX are two very important elements of creating a good conversational AI. I would now like to share with you a third very important element, which is training and testing. More specifically, the language training and testing of your conversational AI. But before I explain to you how exactly to train and test, I think it is very important that you understand how a conversational AI processes language or understands language, or better, how it doesn't understand. Because when we currently talk about natural language understanding in the context of conversational AI, that doesn't mean that this program has a true language understanding. So while I'm talking, or while Judith and Sasha talked, I hope all of you could follow us and understand us and knew what the intention of this whole thing today is. A bot can't do that. Instead, a conversational AI calculates a user's intention, taking into consideration the user's input, the intent it is taught to expect, and the training it receives based on the intent. So Sasha already talked a bit about intents and how you can train them. And I would like to show you, or go a bit more into detail, how this could look in practice. So take, for example, an airline customer service chatbot. The first thing you have to do before you start training the intents is considering what would a user use the conversational AI, or in this case, the chatbot, for. And very basically, you could come up with a user might want information, or maybe it might use the chatbot to perform a certain action. Information could include something like flight details or flight prices, and actions a customer would like to do via the chatbot could be booking a flight or checking in. Now, as Sasha mentioned, all of these intents are trained by connecting it to key phrases and also connecting it to various machine learning techniques, which I won't talk about in detail because this would be a bit much for today. But you can imagine, very simplified, that each of this intents is trained with a kind of word cloud. Certain terms, the bot has learned to connect with certain intentions. Now, as you might imagine, those things, or those key phrases and terms, they are come up with by the development team, or maybe by the technology behind that, but those will probably not be keyed to your customers right away. And also your development team won't be able to come up with a variety of phrases and terms that really covers all of your customers. And this can create huge problems, which you will see in the following example. So I went online. I actually found an airline customer service chatbot, which is still in the beta phase. And I asked it, can you tell me about flight prices? Now, for everyone listening, it is pretty clear that my intention behind this question was, I want to know about flight prices. The bot misinterpreted my question and actually offered me information about the flight status if I entered a certain flight number. So we can clearly see that it miscalculated my intent and thought I was looking for flight details. I rephrased my question to see if I would get a different answer and ask again, no, I want to check flight prices. Again, for everyone or for every human listening to me, it's pretty clear. Again, my intention here is I want to know about flight prices. But the chatbots saw that differently, and this time, instead of information about flight details, it offered me the opportunity to check in. Now I'm a patient person, so I've rephrased my question again and asked, no, I am interested in flight prices. And this time the bot actually understood me and offered to show me ticket prices if I would tell it where I wanted to go. What this example shows is that even though the bot was, or the developers of the bot anticipated that customers might ask for flight prices, they did not train the bot sufficiently, and it took the bot actually 3 iterations and me rephrasing my question several times until I got where I wanted to be. And as you can imagine, real customers might not be as patient and maybe even leave the bot after the first or at least after the second question. So why is it so hard to train a bot? Simply put, we have a lot of variety of natural language, and this makes broad language training extremely difficult because the more variety or the more varied the language inputs are that you provide your bot with, the better the application will be able to recognize an intent. However, to get varied language inputs, you need a large group of different people who speak differently, who think differently to really provide that variety. And as you can imagine, finding a large group of different people to interact with your bot or with your conversational AI is very difficult in the prototype and beta phase, because where are you going to find 50, 60, 70 people that fit your key demographic just like that and that are willing to just chat with your application? So this is a need we identified about 2 years ago, and we had the brilliant idea to come up with a chatbot and virtual assistant testing service, which would address exactly this need. More specifically, what we wanted to do was provide a service that would allow to uncover training gaps by our testers interacting with the applications, and at the same time provide invaluable training data, because the very act of uncovering the training gaps by talking to the bot would already provide the training data needed to actually close that gap. As I mentioned, we had this idea about 2 years ago, and we thought along the lines of the more data, the better. So the more training data we could provide, the more questions our testers asked, the better it would be for our customers. And before I tell you the best practices we figured out over the last 2 years, I would actually kind of like to show you how not to train and test your bot, because this is also something very valuable we learned on our way. So imagine a chatbot of a retail chain. And this chatbot, just like our imaginary airline customer service chatbot, has 4 key intents. It can give information about opening hours, store locations, special offers, and careers. We actually had a test similar to this, and we thought it would be a great idea to have our testers ask as many questions as possible, and thought 300 questions per testers, that would be a good measure. They were not distributed evenly. Our testers were tasked with asking 125 individual questions for opening hours and store locations each, as well as 25 individual questions regarding special offers and careers. Now, some of you already might think 125 individual questions just asking for store locations, that sounds tough. And you were right. This is exactly what our testers thought as well. And I wanted to show you one quote of a tester who addressed this problem specifically. So the tester wrote to us, "I'm not allowed to vary the same question with different locations. I don't think there are 125 different ways to ask for a store location." And this tester was actually right, but also wrong at the same time. The tester was right because for one individual, it is really, really tough to ask 125 individual questions. You have to get very creative. However, in total, it's absolutely possible to ask for store locations in 125 different ways. Actually, we had 36 testers in the test, and they came up with 3,500 questions regarding store location. Admittedly, not all of them were really individual questions, so we did have some repetitions where just the location was switched or where just some words were substituted. But overall, we would estimate that there were about 2,000 questions you could really classify as individual. And now you might think, why then is this a failed example? Because generating that much data is really, really good, isn't it? Yes and no, again. So there was a lot of valuable data in this. However, there were also overly creative questions posed by our testers to the bot, which cannot really be used in training. And these are just some examples. So one tester, for example, thought asking for store locations would also work if you ask for longitude and latitude, which is not a bad way to ask for a location, but something a simple retail chatbot would never integrate. Then another tester or two other testers asked for the locations by connecting the location to something else. So one tester asked if it is possible to use the bus from Bad Homburg to go shopping in one of the stores, asking the bot basically to find all stores that were accessible by the bus. Not a bad question, and actually something a tester or a customer really might ask, but in itself way too complex to teach to a simple bot. Similar to the last example, the tester asked what stores are near the highway, and this again is a good question and probably also something a real customer might come up with, but again very complex to teach your bot. So what this example shows, or is supposed to show you, that yes, quantity is very, very important, because the more training data you have, the better your conversational AI will be able to interact with your whole customer base. However, quality is also very important. So you can't just bot your application with anything. So this was not the only learning we had. Just like Judith had best practices for conversational UX, I've collected some best practices for training and testing your bot. And first and foremost, the really most important thing is build your bot up slowly but consistently. It's much better to start with a few core intents which work really well than to have a bot that in theory can answer anything, but in practice can't answer a simple question. It is also very important to train all intents sufficiently to avoid under and over training, just like we saw with the airline chatbot example. Mentioned several times, use as many different users as possible just to get the most variety in language that you can get. All of us speak slightly differently, all of us think slightly differently, and you need all of this to have an application that can really interact with a large group of different people. I think the last example made this very clear. Limit the individual input. So when we finalized our service, we set certain limits. Each tester we have in a test is not allowed to ask more or do more than 100 interactions, and for each intent, a maximum of 25 to 30 interactions, because we realized that going above that makes our testers overly creative, and therefore the data they generate a bit useless. Also, it is much better than to start with a small amount of testers and a small amount of questions and train in iterations than have one huge block of testing and training. This is also something that Sasha and Judith both mentioned. When you train and test, you should consider what kind of training fits your intents best. So do you have a bot that or do you have the bot that has intents that encompass isolated information? Then you're looking for a free dialogue and a lot of pre-testing. Or does the intent trigger a process? And in that case, it is also very important to not only test the language of your application, but also the underlying functionality. Last but not least, a point I also can't stress enough: never ever stop training your bot, because believe me, the language training will never be done. So now we've shown you a lot over the past 50 minutes. You've seen a lot about 3 very fundamental elements of building a good chatbot or a good conversational AI. And what we now would like to do is give you a little summary and send you home with the 10 do's and don'ts when designing a chatbot. The first one.
Yes, Sasha. I think that's my turn because coming from a company which provides a platform, well, I won't discuss in detail that it's important to have the right feature set, to choose the right platform. The ease of use is important to get designers and developers to work together, extensibility for all your services, third-party integration, operational aspects, privacy, security, all those things are quite important. But I think the most important aspect is that you choose a partner which is passionate about conversational AI, because we are still in the early days. And I think your partner should take the idea of empowering you and what you want to do seriously. He should be agile and react to your needs quite fast. And this is something which makes me proud of working for Cognigy, which is a company which is totally passionate, and everybody believes in the idea and the vision, and everybody tries to make everything possible as fast as possible.
Okay, so the second takeaway we have is you should choose the right people. So as Sasha and I already said, it's not a one-man show to create a chatbot. You need several disciplines. So you need people who know a lot about technology, about screenwriting and linguistics.
The next takeaway would be set the right expectations, also mentioned several times. So users need to know clearly what to do and what not to expect from your application.
Another important learning is the point personality. So as I said in my best practices and tips, think about a bot persona. So think about what the bot really can reflect, and don't try to let your bot pretend to be a human if he is not.
Then language design, also very important. Keep your target group in mind and see to it that the chatbot has or the chatbot personality has a very specific language design.
Another key aspect is talk about failure. So as I said, try to think how the bot reacts when a failure happens. So try to compensate flaws and error loops. So give clear feedback to the users what they can do in order that the bot can understand them.
Smooth handover. So integrate. Or it's very important in a customer facing strategy to integrate a smooth handover and to define a handshake with humans, so that if your customers want to talk to a human, they also have the opportunity to do so.
Next point is make sense of use cases. So as I said, don't try to make just a bot because it's a trend. Try to think about meaningful use cases and provide the user with an additional value when using the bot.
I like to add something to crawl, walk, run here, number 9, because I think this is the most crucial aspect of conversation design. Start simple before you try to make your bot quite complex, because in this case, usually it will fall apart if you try to fulfill too much, because you need to set the right expectation. You have to communicate what the bot supports, and if the user has the expectation to talk with a dog, he knows what to expect from this bot. But if he has no expectation, this probably will lead to a bad conversation. And therefore, please start crawling first and then try to improve the conversational experience to walk. And then if this succeeds, finally run.
And again, last but not least, test. So test in iterations and with your specific target group in mind to really make sure that your bot is always up to the performance it's supposed to deliver.